How is it to be a comedian in these political times?
Well, I think there's a mistake, sort of a misunderstanding about it right now, because people will come up to me on the street and they'll say to me, "Oh my God, you must be having the greatest time in the world, and Trump is the gift that just keeps on giving." And that actually is not the case. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because people think, well, you've got this kind of crazy guy in the White House, and so that lends itself very well to comedy. Actually, comedy works really well when we have a reality that's grounded, that then we can kind of make fun of and make more absurd. And traditionally, when I've written the Borowitz Report, I was dealing with people who were sort of, well, at least in shouting distance of normal.
At the moment, there's a lot of tension between the United States and many of its traditional allies. Immigration and other issues leave the European Union far from united. But China and Russia seem to be enjoying ever warmer relations. Does the West face a dangerous new alliance in the East? I'm Ian Bremmer in downtown Manhattan, and welcome to GZERO World. On this week's show, we'll discuss that Russia-China issue, also the current state of satire with best-selling author, comedian, and New Yorker contributor Andy Borowitz. And on Puppet Regime, things get a little bleepy. Public television loves it when I say that. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. Let's talk about Russia and China. A few weeks ago, these two countries made headlines with joint military exercises. Big ones. Imagine 300,000 Russian soldiers, 36,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes, backed up by troops, tanks, and jets from China's People's Liberation Army, playing war games in Siberia, where there's a lot of space for that sort of thing. It was the largest military exercise anywhere in the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it definitely got attention in Washington. In fact, for America, this is a kind of recurring nightmare. What if Russia and China became real allies? Political, economic, and military allies. That might trigger a brand new Cold War. So is that what's happening? Russia and China both have a beef with the United States, to be sure. The Trump administration has slapped sanctions on Russia, as well as tariffs on more than $200 billion in Chinese exports. Also, both countries want to stop the United States from playing global policemen, patrolling their neighborhoods and backyards, and criticizing the way their governments behave. To push back against the U.S. military presence near their borders, Russia and China work together with a few smaller countries in an organization called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not NATO, but it's not nothing. Russia and China are also natural partners when it comes to energy. Russia is one of the world's leading exporters of oil and natural gas. China consumes vast amounts of oil and natural gas. Buyer and seller fit well together. Are Americans and Europeans now facing a Russia-China alliance? Not quite. Look closer and you'll see that in coming years, Russia and China will compete as much as they cooperate. They'll compete for influence in Central Asia. That's the region that lies between them. For China, they're building a new Silk Road there, the trade route that will connect China to Europe with enormous volumes of trade and cash flowing in both directions. For Russia, these are former Soviet republics, outposts of the Russian Empire. These are political, economic, and military allies that Russia intends to keep. Now look again at oil and gas. Yes, China wants to buy Russian energy, but China wants a low price. Russia's the seller. They want a high price. China can find all sorts of other energy suppliers, lots in the Middle East. That means China can drive a much harder bargain on price. More importantly, Russia's foreign policy is revisionist. They want to restore their influence in neighboring countries, establishing a deeper presence in the Middle East and, if possible, destabilizing the politics of the United States and the European Union. Chinese leaders, by contrast, want a stable, predictable international environment because that's how China continues to grow its economy. Then there's the larger economic mismatch. China's economy is almost 8 times larger than Russia's. China is a giant. Russia's economy is smaller than Canada's. Canada's! Canada. This is no partnership of equals, and both sides know it. To put it simply, China doesn't need Russia the way Russia needs China. China's future and security and prosperity depends far more on the strength of its economy than the strength of its military. The United States is by far China's top trade partner, even with the ongoing trade conflict. Japan is number 2, Germany's number 5. Russia is China's 11th largest trade partner. China actually sends more exports to the Netherlands than to Russia. So China might be willing to join war games in Siberia, and I'm sure they'll continue to cooperate when it comes to pushing back against American power. But China's future depends far more on good relations with the United States and Europe than with Russia. For the foreseeable future, that's not going to change. This week, I sit down with Andy Borowitz. He's a New York Times best-selling author and a comedian who has written for the New Yorker magazine since 1998. He's pretty old. His satirical column, The Borowitz Report, is read by millions of readers around the world. Today, I'll ask him about satire in the age of strongmen, censorship, and threats to the right to ridicule, something we certainly care about here on GZERO World. Let's get to it.
Andrew Borowitz, lovely to be with you.
Love to be with you. No one really calls me Andrew. I think my mom used to call me that, but you can call me Andy.
I do call you Andy.
For our purposes.
I personally call you Andy.
Exactly.
I have been known to do that in the past.
Exactly.
So, how is it to be a comedian in these political times?
Well, I think there's a mistake, sort of a misunderstanding about it right now, because people will come up to me on the street and they'll say to me, "Oh my God, you must be having the greatest time in the world, and Trump is the gift that just keeps on giving," and that actually is not the case. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because people think, well, you've got this kind of crazy guy in the White House, and so that lends itself very well to comedy. Actually, comedy works really well when we have a reality that's grounded that then we can kind of make fun of and make more absurd. And traditionally, when I've written the Borowitz Report, I was dealing with people who were sort of, well, at least in shouting distance of normal. I mean, people like George W. Bush, who comported himself like a normal human being. I mean, it was, in my opinion, a terrible president, but he sort of comported himself like a normal human being. Donald Rumsfeld. These were people that you could then sort of exaggerate, satirize in a way that would show their ridiculousness that was just sort of under the surface. But Donald Trump presents as a clown, and he presents as an unstable person, as a surreal and absurd person. He's also doing sort of this performance art. He's playing some role of Donald Trump, which only he understands, and maybe even he doesn't understand it. So that becomes actually very difficult, because you can't really take his reality, which is surreal, and make it more absurd. It's already absurd, and so he defies satire.
Now, you mentioned Bush, Rumsfeld, Trump. You kind of left open Obama.
Right.
Was that intentional, or?
Well, no, I was thinking about that, because probably the most legendary political satirist in American literature is Will Rogers. And Will Rogers said, "There's no trick to being a satirist when you have the whole government working for you." And so there's really no era where the government or the people in power aren't producing material that people like me can then latch onto and make fun of. The Obama era was interesting because Obama, first of all, was a funny guy. He had funny people writing for him. He would do jokes on himself. He was very funny whenever he had to do the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And he was so kind of intent on being dignified and controlled. It made him very tricky as a target. But he infuriated so many people in the other party around him, and it created so much sort of anger and hysteria and derangement that there was plenty to write about still. So like all the multiple completely pointless repeals of Obamacare became a thing. And the constant demands for his birth certificate, of course, coming from Donald Trump, one of the perpetrators of that, that became a thing. So although he wasn't that easy to write about or that much fun to write about, the Obama years actually provided a lot of comedy.
So the derangement of people that really disliked Obama was part of what made it easier.
Yeah, I mean, I will also say that as a writer, I yearned for the days when Obama really screwed something up badly, because he was usually so controlled that even when he made a mistake, he made it in kind of a dignified way, and he wasn't like flailing about.
But you did point out, you said Obama not very funny, but on the other hand, and hard to make fun of, except occasionally when he gives you an opening, but you had a lot of people on the other side that were deranged by Obama in reaction to Obama, and that was a ripe tableau to go after.
Right.
Now, clearly, the number of people that have been deranged by Trump on the other side is even larger.
Right.
How much of an active target is that for you?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I sort of have it both ways in that I'm constantly making fun of the thirst for his conviction. I mean, I'm constantly making fun of, people sort of looking to Robert Mueller as the savior of humanity, and I do make fun of that, but it sort of works on two levels, because I will make fun of, for example, I will make fun of the former hippies who now love the FBI. I mean, that was a target of mine. And the weird response I get to that from former hippies is they're like, damn right. That's exactly. So I haven't really
And they don't see the irony in that, apparently.
No. So like a lot of what I'm doing is making fun of what I would call liberal fantasies. And the problem is, this is one of the problems with satire in general. People think, and Malcolm Gladwell actually did an interesting podcast about satire where he kind of said that satire is a failure as a principle, as a premise. It's a failure because if you're trying to change people's minds with this kind of comedy, you usually wind up just reinforcing their confirmation bias. I guess where I come out on that is that I don't necessarily think a satirist sits down, unless they're delusional, that a satirist sits down and says, boy, when this piece, this 250-word piece comes out, I'm really going to change a lot of minds. I never feel like I'm going to change anyone's mind. I feel that I've expressed myself and I've made a point, but I never think, when people always say, oh, the pen is mightier than the sword, actually swords often are mightier than pens, I should point out. I don't always think that. I think when people say that comedy is this incredibly powerful weapon, I think the effects of comedy can be very incremental, and I think that comedy and comedians can change the atmosphere around an issue, but I don't necessarily think that satire is this incredible weapon that just rocks the world, because I just don't think it does.
So, the sword has proven mightier than the pen for a number of satirists around the world. We have more journalists now languishing in prison globally than at any point in recent times. In Egypt, the Jon Stewart of Egypt taken off the air and with criminal charges. How do you think journalists in your position in other parts of the world are doing to respond to these times?
I think journalists in general, but certainly more elsewhere, are under a lot of threat. And I say that totally seriously. I think, and really, Ian, it's a bigger issue than just comedians. I mean, comedians really haven't borne the brunt of it the way, say, investigative journalists have, who are being imprisoned, who are being attacked. In our country, we've had newspaper newsrooms who've been singled out by, gun-toting maniacs. And so it's, we do also have an environment in our country where, the President of the United States is saying that people like me and people like you, by virtue of the fact that you're working as a journalist in this program, that we are the enemy of the people. And actually, our role was enshrined by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So the people who wrote that, by virtue of the fact that they put that amendment first, probably did not feel that we were the enemy of the people. I think Thomas Jefferson said that something to the effect that newspapers without government were preferable to government without newspapers. But as you'll recall, like right after 9/11 and the shock of that, it was so easy for so many Americans to capitulate and give up individual liberties out of fear. And it's very easy for a government to create that sense of fear in order to achieve the goal of getting people to relinquish their individual liberties. So I'm worried about it, but I also think we have to fight. I think we have to support journalists. I think we have to support journalism in the courts and financially. And, there's a slippery slope because one thing Donald Trump says quite a bit as sort of a running theme for him, leitmotif, is he'll say, really got to look into the libel laws in this country.
So when you look at a place like The Onion, which in principle, this sort of fake media organization that's all about satire, but also is writing things that clearly some people believe to be true.
Right.
Right? And you also have this whole dynamic of people putting out real news and then response being, can you believe this? This isn't The Onion. There's an overlap there. I mean, to what extent do you think that part of what being a satirist is, what you're aiming for, is to get something so on the nose that there are people out there that believe it to be true?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, one is a question of what is your intention? In my case, I can't speak for The Onion. I know people over there. I have friends over at The Onion. I can't speak for them. But I know in my case, the intention is never to create a hoax or to fool people. As a matter of fact, we label my stories very, very clearly. The New Yorker was worried about this very issue, and they said, what can we put on your stories that will make it clear that these are not the news? And I said, what if we say not the news? And they were like, nailed it. So now, I know.
That was clever.
It was clever.
That was very clever.
It was witty. Mm-hmm. But this whole issue of things, satire seeming like it's real and so realistic that people are fooled by it, that may not be the intention, but I do think when that happens, that shows that you've had an aesthetic success. Because the goal of writing this stuff is that you're trying to be as close to the original thing you're parroting as possible, which means your style, the literary style of writing this stuff, is really trying to hew very close to that whole AP, New York Times, incredibly drab, understated style, so that you could be describing Armageddon, but you have to write it in this incredibly controlled, gray lady style. I don't delude myself into thinking that if I write some piece about Trump doing something insane, that then I'm suddenly swaying elections or something.
No, but you have had aesthetic success. I'm thinking back on, for example, with the Washington Post, when Bezos bought it.
Yes.
And the Chinese state media actually believed
my version. Yeah,
that was?
Well, my version, I remember my editor at the New Yorker at the time called me and said that Bezos had just bought the Washington Post, and could you do something about it? And so my headline and the story indicated that Jeff Bezos said that he'd only bought the Washington Post because he had clicked on it by mistake. He had gone to the Washington Post website. It was a big, I guess, internet shopping error, and it was wound up in his cart. And it wasn't until he got his American Express
Amazon
call.
thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
it was a little play on Amazon.
Yeah.
And it did, it's funny when you talk about things, we're talking about satire and confirmation bias. It had two wildly different reactions. In this country, people got the joke, and people are always mad about getting stuff from Amazon that they didn't mean to buy, so they got what I was making fun of, and did very well in this country. But it had this sort of ancillary market of about, I don't know, tens of millions of readers in China who read this because it had been linked to by state media, and they must have just thought, oh my God, this is why our economy is so much superior to the American economy, because people like Jeff Bezos are buying things by mistake, and they're a bunch of clowns. So I think their confirmation bias actually played a role in that. They wanted to see us as buffoonish in our business dealings, and that seemed to, this is just my theory, of course.
They were the hippies that now support the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. We can't, I always come back to, we really can't control how people, I don't think in any art form, if I can use that pretentious term, but I think in anything you put out there, you really can't control the response. You don't know how people are going to take it.
Have you had, I would think one other way of feeling great about a successful piece of biting satire is when the target of your satire said, yeah, that was funny. You got me, I appreciated that. Does that happen? And does that happen often?
You know, I think I'm too low on the food chain. Like, I think that people are always saying, like, so have you heard a lot from the White House? Like, no one from the White House. I never hear from the White House. I think they're kind of more obsessed with people like, obviously, Trump is obsessed with Alec Baldwin because Alec Baldwin is actually getting up on stage and impersonating him. And so he will actually take time out of his day and tweet about how the guy making fun of him on Saturday Night Live is a disaster and failing and all of that. I just think, first of all, I don't think that Trump, if I had to guess, is a big reader of the New Yorker magazine.
Do you want to be appreciated by your targets?
No, I have no interest in that.
None?
No.
Really, not even a tiny bit?
No, I'm not, you know, I think one of the things, Ian, is I spent the first chunk of my adult career in Hollywood, and I was a TV producer. And I think that experience really inoculated me from being that interested in famous people. I've got to say, like, it's not that I'm not impressed by famous people or I think that they're worse than us. I just think, as Us magazine would say, they're just like us. They're not that much more interesting or less interesting.
Now, I mean, you've said that you consider this sort of an art form, and I think
I sort of regret that already.
Well, there you go. So I was just wondering
it's
how
on
much
tape.
Your art, how much of it do you want it to be just something that people appreciate in the moment for its own sake? And how much of it are you thinking, there's a broader message that I'm trying to get across, there's purpose to what I'm doing, and I'm hoping this is part of affecting change?
Well, leaving aside the whole art thing, in terms of let's use the word work.
Okay.
I'm
How about
cool with
oeuvre?
that.
We'll go with oeuvre.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's go for oeuvre. In terms of like what I'm trying to achieve when I write something, I'm really trying to entertain first and foremost. I'm trying to entertain for that day, for that moment, because by the nature of what I do, it's so ephemeral. I think all creative work is pretty ephemeral. Like there are very few novelists from 100 years ago that we're still reading when you consider how many people were writing novels then. So it's all, let's face it, I mean, I believe in, you know, the sands of time and entropy and all of those, inexorable forces. So it's all ephemeral. But what I do is super ephemeral because even I will go back 2 years and read a piece I wrote and be like, what was I even writing about? What was the news peg of that? Because it's just so much of the moment. So my goal is really to entertain for that moment. I think it's changed a little bit in the last 18 months, 2 years of this Trump era, simply because I feel that we're living in a national emergency. So to the extent that I can use my comedy to activate people, to get people who are maybe so depressed that they wouldn't think of, say, working for a candidate or raising money for a candidate or working for the International Rescue Committee, which, as you know, is one of my favorite organizations. And I try to raise money for things that I believe in. I've gotten a little bit more of a sense of, trying to do something positive to make our country and our world a little bit better. But that doesn't so much inform the writing. It's not like I don't sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to make a grand statement here that it's really going to, because as I said before, I just don't think that satire, and especially my satire, I don't think it has that capacity. But I think I tend to use more my role as a satirist, my role as somebody who has an audience. I try to use that to do incremental good, like raise a little money for somebody or something.
Andy Borowitz, artist, commercial satirist.
Great
to be with you.
Of creator.
Absolutely, of creator. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Ian.
And now to Puppet Regime, where we learn that most of geopolitics is people yelling four-letter words.
Hi, folks. Now that GZERO World is on public television, that means bleeping out some of your favorite four-letter words. But to make it fun, we're going to let you guess what they are. First up, a discussion between Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, and Vladimir Putin.
Look, the fake news media, they always attack me whenever I say what I think about.
Well, maybe you shouldn't be so boorish when you talk about.
You know, you're not such a great example of yourself, Angela.
I don't like this type of locker room talk.
Please.
Donald, please, please. The least thing we need is for her to be more committed to.
Fantastic! Next round, we have French President Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump, and Mark Zuckerberg.
In France, one of the things we think most about is, Look, I'll be honest with you, I'm always thinking about too. Even when I'm doing other stuff, it's like I can't get it off my mind.
We knew that would get Trump's attention.
You know, Facebook is still a great place to find.
And now, oh, look, it's National Security Advisor John Bolton. I'm not sure who invited you here, but...
Can we just destroy already? Those
Phew! Good thing these idiots have stopped talking so much about the ICBM.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week. Same place, same time. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.